Welcome to Conversations. Today, we are having a conversation on colonialism, and my guest is Mr. Argent Kvasnikoff, who lives here in Alaska with me. Not with me, but in Alaska State. And
Yep.
just a few drives away,
Mhm.
maybe about a couple of hour drive from Homer, Alaska.
Oh,
I'm going
30
to let
minutes
him.
at most.
Oh, how much?
30 minutes about.
Oh, okay. Closer than I
Yeah.
realized. Well, I'm going
Yeah.
to let you talk about yourself a little bit so people will know who you are. He is a great artist here and a leader among his people, and he's going to share more information about his work and who he is before we start talking about colonialism.
Sure. Hi, I'm Argent Kvasnikoff, and I am so grateful to have this opportunity to speak with Sky and to also share on this platform. It's really an amazing opportunity, and I'm so honored. Like Skywalker said, I am an artist. I live in Untitled, Alaska, and I'm a part of the tribe of the same name. And our tribal territory includes the South Peninsula and places like Homer, where Skywalker is, and I do work with him quite a bit. I wouldn't say I'm technically a leader. That's kind of a conversation that we've been having lately. I can certainly be a type of a spokesperson or advocate, but maybe not a literal leader, but I do engage with public bodies, and I work with the Vanell Street Art Center in Homer. And I've had a very, I would say, although it's a short career, maybe 8 years at most of being just a full-time dedicated artist, I have been engaged in art projects and how culture interacts with art for since I was at least a kid. So um, I'm really interested in kind of looking at from a more of an indigenous perspective, but also it does apply to race about how our structures and our culture kind of influence and create these illusions or barriers that we have between each other. And really, it's more of a matter of all the things, all of our good points are also our bad points. And sometimes when we get to be too uh, individualistic and too um, into our celebrating what makes us unique, sometimes that can put up a wall unintentionally. And so I'm really interested in breaking down those boundaries and assumptions and for the better. And I think what conversations, especially like these, do is they help break that down. They say we're not all that different, and a lot of our language that we use, we all have very similar thoughts. Maybe we don't have the same opinions necessarily, but we're all people, and at the end of the day, we just want to feel like we're in a community. We want to feel like we've got food and shelter, and that's what unites us. And everything else we can split hairs about. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And since this is the first conversation we're having and interactive, I just want to explain to people who are watching, whenever you watch, conversations are just that, conversations between two people who share an interest in the topic. And consider that you are just coming in on the conversation, not that you're participating because this isn't live, but you'll get a chance to get an idea of what colonialism means to a Black woman and an Alaska Native. And you can make comments at the bottom about if you've gained an understanding of colonialism or if you have another perspective. Excuse me. So, to begin this conversation, I want to share the screen for a few minutes, and I want us to look up the word. colonialism because so we can have at least a shared definition. Colonialism. Because as I was preparing for our talk, I started to think about I haven't really thought about colonialism. What
Mm-hmm.
is the real definition of colonialism? And it
Mm-hmm.
can have, I'm sure, many different definitions. But here's the one that's popped up from our favorite source of information, Google. Colonialism as a noun, the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. Well, I guess that's pretty clear.
Yeah, it's pretty clear, but I think if you look at the definitions of settlers and exploiting and all of those elements in that, I think if you apply that very literally, you could consider a lot of places in the world that you might not think of as being colonialized. So I think the whole conversation about colonialism is not so much that it uh, exists or doesn't exist. I think it's to what extent. And I think that in some ways, colonialism might be a little bit of a boogeyman word, um, but also in some ways, there is a lot of active colonialism that people don't think of it as colonialism because it's not um, directly supported by any government or culture that has these slogans. Like everybody talks about manifest destiny here in the United States and how that was a big push. And it's like, well, that's true, but you also have to take into account how the state of Alaska is right now. You could make an argument. I'm not sure if I totally agree with it, but you could make an argument that it's partially colonialized because we have one main industry that's controlling our financial interests. And whether that's good, bad, that's up to people to kind of think for themselves and to kind of work that out. But using that definition, you could make an argument that that's an act of colonialism because you have a state or a government that is supporting that primary interest. And so as many legal protections as people have and as many opportunities that they have to express self-governance and control, there is that economic interest that's a part of it. And so you have to like really open your mind and think about maybe colonialism doesn't come in the form of a campaign with brochures and a label. Maybe it comes in little tiny forms here and there. And I would also um, be chagrined to say that it's something that affects everyone. It's not just a particular culture, it's not a particular group. And what I find really interesting about what's happening in places like, very much like Alaska now, is that there is this whole realization, especially in the commercial fishing industry and community, that, oh, colonial practices can happen to anyone. They can happen to us. And and like I said, I don't know the answers to those debates, but I just think it's really fascinating how these things can pop up and in places you'd never expect.
You brought up a lot of good
Yeah,
points
I
that
apologize.
oh no, I'm great.
Yeah,
This is what I wanted because
yeah.
the whole, the reason I focus on colonialism is because we're launching on October 12th.
Hmm.
And some people don't know the significance of that date.
Hmm.
I mean, most Americans know it's uh, observed as Columbus Day.
Yes, and until you mentioned that just now, I have forgotten.
Yeah, but in
Personally,
Alaska, isn't it a Native American Day in Alaska?
I don't know what is exactly called officially now, but
or
I know,
Indigenous Day?
yeah, I'm not sure. And that's something that I find very interesting is how people react to that, and how they, because there already is a Native American Day, so it's a bit like a state specific version, I suppose. So I'm not entirely sure.
Right, because well, there's a lot of states who have taken up call changing the name of the holiday to
Hmm.
Indigenous Day, and so maybe, so I'm not sure exactly because I know Alaska has a Native American Day, and I thought it was
Hmm.
October 12th, but then one day I realized no, I'm not sure which day it is, but I know there are states that are observing October 12th
Hmm.
as an Indigenous Day instead of celebrating Christopher Columbus's mistake.
Hmm.
But when I look at the day, that is when actually colonialism was like that was, to me, I see that as the beginning. I mean, even
Yeah.
though there have been some things going, but once he did that, and then they just, it just started to be more and more and more, and then the Catholic
Hmm.
Church got involved. And what I, and so that's why I chose the topic. And then because racism is so closely tied to colonialism, because it was used, racist ideas were
Hmm.
used to perpetuate, support, and justify colonialism, whether they
Absolutely.
were talking about uh, civilizing these uncivilized African and Asians and native indigenous people, or
Hmm.
teaching them the truth, true God. But
Hmm.
basically, whatever their ultimate goal always was, to get the land, to get what was in the land or on top of
Hmm.
the land, and to try and get as much work out of the people there that they could, or make them go away.
Yeah.
So so they didn't succeed, and it's never going to happen, because even in every country, and this kind of experience hasn't only happened in the United States. It's happened all over the world. It's happened in
Hmm.
Asian countries with different groups. It's like indigenous peoples in almost every country in the world, even
Hmm.
Asian countries, countries where there weren't Anglos or white people or Europeans, have had this problem that's caused by governments and businesses who don't appreciate the value of protecting the earth and
Yes.
living a simple life. You
Yeah,
know?
absolutely. And what is also um, interesting to me is how it's almost like a science that what pushes those things to happen over time is the idea that this whatever we're doing is better, and and that definition of who gets to decide what's better, that is what that's what needs to be addressed. And so it all comes down again to just talking. People that don't respect each other enough to actually sit down and go over what these definitions are, and what people's values are, and to show that kind of vulnerability in a way, uh, that you can't make those common definitions with people. And without those definitions of what what you might think might be better is different from someone else's better, then whoever has the most um, resources or backing at the time, they're just going to railroad on through. And what is really insidious about it is oftentimes most of those people aren't even conscious that they're doing it. They've just, and even over multiple generations, you can have people who are born into families and have children and die and leave this world without having any knowledge that they were part of this system. And that's it's kind of creepy. It's kind of like it's almost like an alien movie, which in which you see people have these alternate reality experiences that's not real life, and and I think that's where a lot of the understanding has to come in for people like me. Is I think we need to at least have um, the the patience to be um, receptive to what people's language is, even if it's indirectly racist, even if it's um, questionable in some way. I think we have to be able to at least hear it and then parse it out and come back to it with a new question and say, well, when you said this, are you talking about this or this? And to really dissect words and rhetoric, and to just address what those mean. And I think that's the only way you can actually meaningfully address colonialism, is to really challenge cultural values, and to look for that. Maybe there's very little commonality, but at least try to find some.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, especially most white Americans, wouldn't think that this country themselves or the government are involved in any way with colonialism.
Mhm.
Yet, the deep, aside from the obvious economic things, economic abuses, all the land, native lands that they've taken, and the treaties they've broken, and particularly here in Alaska, this mess they did here.
Mhm.
Because I attended. Well, today is the last of 4 sessions that were done by the Center of Alaska, and with three trainers, and two of them are native. One of them's Alaska Native lady, and one's Navajo. And it's called decolonize. No, it's called allyship in action. But
Mhm.
they've been talking about decolonizing the mind, and they've been talking about. They gave the whole history of what happened in Alaska,
Mhm.
particularly with the United States and the treaties, and
It's very patchwork and complicated. It's
yeah,
like its own nation's worth of history, and um, yeah, it's very complicated.
yes, it's unique. And that's is what a lot of Americans don't think about. They don't, they watch. A lot of people don't even think that there are Native people if they don't live either in an
Mhm.
urban area or near a nation or a reservation. They pretend they don't think about
Yeah.
people, and it's just interesting to me and kind of sad. But there's I lived and worked in Arizona in the Navajo and the Hopi uh,
Hmm.
nations, and when I came here, I ended up working in for the Alaska Native Community Clinic, and it's a shame, but people don't know. But the thing about colonialism, and the thing I think is our biggest problem outside of the bigger things about economics and land, but on the interpersonal, is recognizing and actually decolonizing our minds. Not
Hmm.
only uh, first for white people is recognizing that it exists, but for
Hmm.
people of color, a lot of things we've taken on
Hmm.
is not from us. It doesn't come from our culture. It doesn't come from our background. It doesn't feel right to us, but we felt we have to do it. But that's really not true. And I think and actually over the past few years, people have stepped away from that and are doing things their own way more and more. And
Yes.
that's what's important, you
Hmm.
know.
And one of the things that I love to talk about, um, and having a lot of recent conversations about cultural events and identity, and that is people are persistently surprised, especially in Homer, up here, because they are surprised to learn that even though we don't have reservations, we still have um, territory that is in some degree uh, recognized by not just the U.S. government, but other tribes. And so it's kind of like breaking that myth that, oh, Native Americans don't believe in ownership. It's like, well, maybe they don't believe in titles and deeds and property taxes, and maybe they believe that people should be able to utilize things as they need, but it doesn't mean that the idea of ownership doesn't exist. That's always existed. And I think that is part of the colonialist narrative, is to, well, they don't know anyway, so, let's just disregard them. And so I love telling people who live here and in Homer and Anchor Point, and I was like, yeah, you're kind of not only is there a nation, but you're living in it right now. You may not be a citizen, but you're living in it. and and having those realizations for people is really fun and interesting, because I think it makes them think about a whole new way. It's like all of a sudden they're privy to this knowledge that this place that they've thought that they are, have settled in and taken up roots, and come to find out there's this whole other world where they're still pretty much foreign. And that's a really interesting conversation, because it's like it puts the shoe on the other foot, so to speak. And I love to get people to think about that.
Yeah, well, that's what a lot of people have started doing, and they were doing that in this training, is having people say if they knew what traditional lands they were on.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Asia's been doing that, at Bunnell. That's why I know I'm the nine. And I
Yeah.
actually had done some reading when I first came here. I came across a thesis that was written about the Nina storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that really interesting. She talked about the language. And that's the thing that's sad to me about colonialism, is, and why it's tied to racism, is that whole thing, concept that somebody knows better than the
Yeah.
people who are there. And
Mm-hmm.
specifically, it was the Europeans felt they knew better. They were going to justify it. You know, I think in Asian countries and things where it was just kind of more, I don't know histories. I do know other Asian countries would come in and take people's lands and did that, and they had wars, but at least they were the same peoples, and they had the same cultures and the same backgrounds. And I know that in African cultures, people could, they'd have their little wars or disputes, but people could become part of a community, serve in the
Mm-hmm.
community. There wasn't that kind of slavery, even though the Europeans laid this tale for years that, oh,
Mm-hmm.
well, they have slaves. Well, every country would imprison people and maybe call them slaves, but
Yeah.
they didn't use them the way that the Western people did, the Europeans used people.
No, what
So,
was really specific about that period was the um for me, when people talk about history in the 1800s, they say, oh, it was factory started the Industrial Revolution. When I believe that the Industrial Revolution, in my mind, actually started a few hundred years before that, with this maybe not a literal machine, but the quote unquote machine of slavery started. And because that was such a fine tuned, specific method and process, it was very, in other cultures, and even in Denina cultures, like what my tribe was historically, is part Denina. And in any other language in the world, you can find words for slaves or people who are, disenfranchised in some way, but not to the scale of that machination. And that was just because, at least in other places, you were aware of the conflict. But when that machine was put together, it was as if it was just a tool. it was just a machine that was so depersonalized. And I think when people talk about um, slavery and the evolution of Black culture in the Americas, I think they need to understand what makes that different is that machination and how it was never treated as a conflict. It's just something that people did. They nobody knew it was a problem. The people that were involved, and so it was like completely dehumanizing. And at least in other cultures in history and in conflicts, those were results of internal battles and struggles. And even in a battle, you have to recognize the 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 skill of your enemy. But this wasn't even a battle. This was just like cattle, more or less. And I think that's the difference that people need to really understand when they think about American slavery in particular, um, and in Brazil and Canada for some time, and really all over the Americas was that was a result of a dehumanizing machination, um, and and why people are still very interested in addressing it is because of the future and how we need to learn things from that to try as hard as we can to not have that happen again. And and for some people that's very uncomfortable because of their family histories, whatever. I love when people go on those shows, the who do you think you are, blah blah blah. And I remember hearing, I forget who it is, I wish I remembered, but they found out that this actor was coming on that show, and they found out that his great grandparents way back when were one of the biggest plantation and slave traders in, like, all of Georgia at one point. And he or she, I don't remember, asked the show not to show that, and they refused. They said, no, this is what we found. And so instead of being honest about that, they just quit the show altogether. And it didn't come out until much later that that had actually happened. So I think that kind of running away from it doesn't help. And
Right.
and I think the best people in the world who know what it's like to maybe not, uh, people always want to say, they're hung up on the words apology, and they're hung up on what meaningful restitution means. But I think the most important part is just the acknowledging that it happened. And I feel that what modern Germany does in regards to the Second World War era in their educational system and their outlook on it is kind of, it should be a model, I think, for the rest of the world, because they're very honest about it. They went through this period of course, shell shock, denial, like a grief process. But now they're very open about it in schools and teaching kids about what happened, what went wrong, and why, and about the emotions involved and the misconceptions. And if we can get to that point, I think it might be scary for people, but I think it would be really beneficial if we could be able to do that a lot more than we are now. Um,
Yeah. That's why call it story healing,
mhm,
because the depth of the healing that's needed to be done in this country is so great. And people, yeah, people feeling guilty about your ancestors being slaveholders, don't feel guilty. Do something about it.
mhm,
If you've inherited something from that, good. If you're bitter about it, get over it.
yeah.
you know, or but if, because a lot of people, contrary to what they always show in a lot of the movies of how the South was devastated and people lost all their stuff, hey,
Mhm.
they were given money after the Civil War. Nobody talks about that.
Yep.
I had to read that. That was one of the facts and stamped,
Mhm.
one of the little facts that they don't talk about. No, they were given money to recover. And the
Mhm.
people who suffered most and the people who still sometimes are the most prejudiced were the poor whites who
Mhm.
didn't get much reconstitute. They weren't given too much money. It was just the way it is still in the United States, where the money goes to the people or the corporations who already have the money.
Mhm.
So the thing that I'm finding it, and when we look at this country particularly, almost every problem can be tied to racism, a racist
Mhm.
idea decision
Yes.
from how, from guns that were produced before the Civil War to stop Black people from uprising, to how policing is done, to how women are treated in childbirth. Of course, there's this constant contradiction in the United States of being against abortion but wanting to sterilize women of color.
Mhm.
And I mean, and that's happened it's happening now.
Yes, it is.
So, you know, and so that's why that these point in history of these protests have once again brought this issue to the forefront. But
Mhm.
already people are saying, I saw something that was saying already the interest in Black Lives Matter is declining by some poll. But we can't let it decline anymore.
No.
This is a conversation that has to continue and continue and continue in different ways. And that's what we're doing here. That's what we come together for, to have these conversations and to share them with others. And to get people to come in here to have these conversations, because it's difficult to have them on Facebook. Uh, those forums get kind of crazy. Sometimes people
Oh
respond,
yeah.
sometimes they don't. But I think that when people make a commitment and are opening to hearing from different people, we'll grow. And that's what I want to see happen with these conversations. This is the first one. I'll have another one for this event, and then we'll have different topics.
Mhm.
And some of them I'll make public, some of them will be just for here. So, what do you think? One more question. What do you think can help people? Well, it's actually a two-part question. First,
Okay.
for white people, what do you think would help them become more aware of their colonialist or racist ideas? I'll ask that one, then I'll ask the second one.
Um, that's very complicated because I think there's uh, one thing that I want to kind of start to answer with that is the whole idea of a white person is just as much a myth as race is. And I think what these protests and political movements are starting to make people realize, um, quote unquote, white people, is their skin color doesn't determine their values. It doesn't determine their perspective. It doesn't determine their culture. And I think that's what's really uncomfortable for people right now, both pro and the people who are against, is that myth is starting to break down a little bit. Even if it's just a little bit, it's really uncomfortable to look at that painful truth just sitting there. Um, so what I would say is maybe instead of focusing on the fact that you're white and tacitly adopting victimhood about it, in doing so, maybe you can sit down with yourself and figure out what your individual ideas and values are, and think about what your culture is. And I think that's what most white people never do, is they very rarely meaningfully think about what their culture is. And unless they've had a lot of um, experience in university courses talking about all the history of sociology and anthropology. They're never not going to get there. And I love, speaking of ancestry, I love that commercial for that, I think it was 23andMe, where the guy says that oh, my family's German, blah blah blah, and then he got this test through 23andMe, and oh, he found out he's Scottish, and so he just changed these clothes. And for me, I'm like, that doesn't make any sense at all. You didn't change anything. A blood test can't tell you what your values are. A blood test can tell you what your culture is. Um, a blood test can show you, you know, some genetic information, but that's not culture. That has nothing to do with it. So it's that whole myth about belonging and being special is so weird. And I read about this museum in Ireland where it's a full museum just dedicated to Irish people from the United States, pretty much.
Wow.
And they offer instant testing, and they can kind of guess, you know, which county or lineage you're from, and that you can't commodify culture in that way. I think you need to embrace where you are, and and I like how I think the United States has started to do it a little bit. I'm not sure the extent, but I know that Canada has for some time. Is in the census, they're now allowing people to use their own ethnic terms when they respond. And so you have these huge pockets of people who are just saying, well, I don't know, I don't feel any particular affinity with any of these cultures that evolved from all these other places. I feel like I'm just from here. And even though they might not be an indigenous person of any native, they are still of a place. And so they identify with that place as an ethnicity. They'll either say Canadian or they'll say Quebecois or whatever it may be. And I love looking at that patchwork of information that they have, because you start to see these real distinct pockets of where people respond that way. And you look at those places, and usually they're in places that have a real intense diverse history. And I think the more that white Americans can think that way, and of course not in any way to override what indigenous and Native American nations and rights are, but to also take on that localization in your mentality and embrace what you grew up with, what values you were taught by example, um, what you actually had. You can't learn culture from a history book. That's not how it works. You're just learning cultures of the past. And what makes me completely bonkers about even other native cultures here is a lot of these revival movements and revitalization movements, they're based on information that was recorded by white anthropologists several years ago. And they're the people that got to choose the words for the translations. They're the people that got to choose what the semantics meant. They're the people that got to choose what things symbolized or what they didn't. And it's very much like this. So when I see these people in revitalized performance groups, or if it's visual art in some way, it feels like a hollow experience to me, because I'm like, if that's not something you inherited, why are you mimicking it from the pages of a book? And I think part of that colonialist perspective is we need to break down those illusions and just have complete honesty and embrace your loss. And that's something that I am very, very happy about with my tribe in particular, and our leaders, is we're very mixed. And in fact, in the US Census, the first time we were in the US Census, they couldn't determine which ethnicity or even race we were mostly. So they just wrote Ninilchik Creole. They just made up a whole new term. And that's something I really, and today, the thing I respect a lot about our leaders is they understand, you know, we, we can honor our culture and our roots and the things that were here first that we've inherited, but we also have to recognize that whether it was through colonialist practices, force, whatever it is, that the whole reason any of us are here today is because of meeting of these people. And so our existence is like a direct challenge to the idea that race matters. And and I have felt so much pressure, as has other people in my group and family, of either not being, certainly not being white enough, but it would surprise people to know how often, and much more often in my personal case, I have felt pressure of not being native enough. And it's really interesting experience. And what I find really inspiring about our leaders now is they're totally embracing the idea of we don't have to stick to these labels. We can be distinct. We know what our values are. We know how we organize ourselves. We understand that all these different influences are a part of our lives now, but that doesn't take anything away from us. That just adds to us, and it's another chapter in our story. And so that's what I'm really thankful for. And I also think that could apply to white people. I think if they start to look at themselves, and even people of color actually, in terms of really localizing and personalizing what their culture is, it would be so beneficial. And to not feel like you're a part of this big, broad term based on a genetic factor, more or less. It's just, it's bonkers to me. I mean, we might as well be organizing race by, I don't know, who's got a longer ring finger than pointer finger. Like I remember all those banners on the internet when those things was like, if your finger is this long, it means this, and it's just silly like that. So yeah, it was just, feel free to be questioning what those cultural labels are, and what they actually mean. Um, it's so important, and it's not just for you; it's for your future generations as well.
You bring up so much. You can pretty much answer the other question I was going to ask, but because you brought up a lot of things for people to think about, and it is good to expand or allow people to choose how they want to identify themselves, particularly
Mm-hmm.
mixed race children, mixed race people. They
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't, and they do that with Latinos.
Mm-hmm.
They're the only people who can be white or black, which is still, I mean, considering the rainbow range you get in Latino,
Yeah.
just like with Native, no,
Yeah.
just like with Native Americans and
Mm-hmm.
even black people, because I'm black, but I'm not as white as I'm looking on the screen. I am pale, and so because we're mixed in this country, in the same way in England, in any country where which has been a majority of white people. And this is the other thing. There's so many things tied in with this, because the thing that's bringing some white people in this whole resurgence of racism is also tied to the fact, and this whole anti-immigration thing is tied to the
Mm-hmm.
fact that this country is not this big white majority.
Mm-hmm.
And some states, and they still keep wanting to push it down, California and Texas are practically majority Latino.
Mm-hmm.
In California, you get the black people and all kinds of people added in California too, and in Texas too. There's a heavy Asian population in Texas,
Mm-hmm.
Asian Americans with Southern accents.
Yeah.
I worked
Uh-huh.
in the school there. I looked up with a Southern accent. This younger lady, Asian. So what you're saying is true, that people can have communities and
Mm-hmm.
develop their own, interactions. But part of that problem to develop these communities is having these conversations, these story
Absolutely.
sharings, especially because in a lot of places still there's segregation, or else in some communities people don't really interact that are integrated because of whatever. So that's why the concept of having stories, having conversations, and then
Yeah.
looking honestly at your own experiences, at historic experiences, and how all of these things tie together and affect everything.
Yes.
And that's what's important for us to do. I
Yeah.
just,
And like those, and all those people, like I mentioned on that commercial and on that show, they have these loose idea of cultural labels, but how do they apply to them if it's not something that people have talked about with them? If it's not something that they know about and maybe not necessarily practice, because everybody has their own, you know, how important cultural practices to them or not. But if it's not a part of their upbringing in their life, how can a blood test just assign you culture? It's very strange. So you do need to have those conversations, and like and and for your children, um, for parents of, of white children, you need to show them what they are a part of and have them understand that as much as you point out other people and their differences, because I think that's the very odd focus I see, in the white perspective, is they want to see and show children, of course, how the world is diverse and they mean well, but it's always in the language of those are what those other people do. That's what those other people do. And children really desperately need to feel like they have something that they do. And and it's okay for children to feel like, of any ethnicity, race, whatever, it's okay for children to feel like they have things that they identify with that others don't. And so to never have that feeling of isolation, and learning how to evolve your personal comfort and dignity from that, uh, is really scary for people. And that's not something white Americans have had to deal with, because it's always been assumed. So it's like a muscle that has never been exercised, and that self dignity and that self identity. And so you really have to think about that just as much as you think about other lifestyles and histories, and you know what is you. And of course, one of the great things about learning about other cultures and people is you start to figure out who you are a bit better. And that's something I really liked about, I didn't really know him very well because he died when I was fairly young, but my grandfather was always a proponent of people, maybe not necessarily attending college, but at least traveling and seeing how people around the world live, because he always believed that can only help to make you better and understand who you are. And I believe that is incredibly true. And um, that is just so important. And to sidetrack about what you said about Latino people, my very best friend from college, was, I went to college in Canada, and he was from Brazil, and we're still very good friends today. And it was so funny for him because in Brazil he would be considered white, but in Canada and in the United States where he works sometimes, he's considered Latin. Oh, you're not white, you're Latin. And so that experience for him was really eye-opening, um, to kind of, and it was eye-opening for me too, because I didn't understand why he thought he was white. I thought,
yeah.
Why do
See,
you think you're white? I don't get
but
it.
that's the way it is. I remember years and years ago, a friend of mine, she was a friend of mine, and she was a lighter skinned than me, but she was very, very in black. She's the blackest woman around. She went to Africa and they called her white.
Mm-hmm.
And she got upset because
Yeah.
she is light skinned. And that's, other countries where people are darker, only in the United States and in like European countries where do they classify people, but particularly United States, because
Mm-hmm.
in Russia, the poet Pushkin, who would have in the 1800s would have been a slave in America, was an influential writer, and I
Yeah.
did a YouTube video about him, and that video every so often has gotten more comments from Europeans and primarily Eastern Europeans saying he was not black.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because they're very proud of their culture, and they do beauty. He's actually, I get this magazine and saw that in the country that he comes from, they have these beautifully designed, artistically designed subway stations, and one
Mm-hmm.
of them is dedicated to him. So basically, really, it's a good way to end the conversation is seeing how colonialism and racism really have different effects and can affect different places and people in different ways, because
Yeah.
he is honored and loved in Russia, and they're going to
Mm-hmm.
say but I mean, he had curly hair. He didn't look like he had, he was mixed, and it was
Yeah.
either his grandfather's great grandfather who was African.
Mm-hmm.
So by our standards, he's a black man. By their
Yeah.
standards, no, he's one of us, which is
Yep.
good.
Mm-hmm. It's and that reminds me of the going back to elections, remembering the first Obama election. That was really fascinating because it was people accepted that he was black because that's how we frame things. Like I think here we're a glass half full people, I guess you could call it, when it comes to race and color. Um, but it was really interesting to hear the people who were using some racist terminology. They always made a point to correct people and say, well, he was half black, he's half white. It's like, first of all, does that matter? And second of all, I think it did two things. It showed how prejudice is tied to a sense of ownership in a way, because it's like owning the right to say he's this type of president. Um, but also, on the other hand, it made people question, well, why are we calling him a black president? Isn't he just a president? And I love that realization that people had, and how that kind of changed over time, and yeah. So I think ever since then, I think that's why um, getting to the meat of these labels is really important, and to just be open to what people are offering and actually listening to what they have to say, because regardless of who you think is in your culture group or not, they might have completely different opinions. You might have exactly the same ones. You just don't know until you find out. So you have
Right,
to give people the space to do that.
right, and that's the challenge here in the United States, is to give people the
Mhm.
space to get to know each other, to not feel threatened, to not get caught up in all these things that don't relate between two people who are not, shouldn't even be in adversaries. So this
Yes.
has been wonderful talking with you, Arjan. We could probably
Mhm.
talk forever. We'll have other conversations.
Thank
And
you
thank
very much for
you.
having me.
You're welcome. And thank you for watching, whoever you are out there, and whenever you watch, and come back for more conversation.